Hello everyone, today we talk about traditional history, introducing specifically the divine meaning of regality, right? So the limits of man, which is a topic we addressed recently also in that video about the Renaissance, humanism, and that we have come to toy with essentially ever since we began this series about traditional history, which I count now to, in fact, expand on a more regular basis, given that it is a bit like the cornerstone, in my opinion, of historical interpretation, and it explains just all you need about the actual meaning of past cultures, and also our own, telling the truth, because this doesn't travel, let's say, on a matter of personal opinion of any kind, but on universal values, which is a completely different thing. In fact, transcends humanity as we know it. And we have seen how in every traditional civilization there was a character who, by virtue of his innate or acquired superiority over the human condition, embodied within the temporal order the living and sort of efficacious presence of a power that came from above, right? This is a concept I expressed especially in those videos about the Holy Roman Empire. We talked about imperial majesty. We began to discuss further the Habsburgs and what was a bit the deal, not just of, say, in fact, a polity like another, but of the traditional meaning of the empire and of Romanity, and why today we will not explain it that much, but we will look at the figure of the Pontifex Maximus, for example, that in Rome was really the, in fact, highest religious magistrate, in virtue not of, again, the call to a function that, as we would explain the mechanism, say in secularistic or modernistic terms, it was called just to cover, but because he was really deemed to have, by a degree, transcended human dimension, transfigured divinely to a degree, again, because this is the point about every human, that by having a spark of divinity and maintaining it throughout all life, because that's essentially what makes the thing, has different levels of self-actualization and thus of closeness to the divinity, or distance conversely, right? But we'll see it now. So the most important thing to appreciate about such characters, right, and their presence as beings, is that they weren't quite just seen as, say, humans, but as, in part, God themselves, right? The thing overlapped, right? But of course, in a reality in which most humans are really understood as standard, right, and by an unimpressive average by definition, and that half of them are actually even worse than that, the sense that, of course, just a human condition per se, that may not be commensurable humanly, but is obviously understood and felt to be extremely distant from the divine one, would allow to highlight the ones who were essentially endowed with the greatest virtue, who, as a consequence, would also manage to achieve the greatest accomplishments, right? And the leaders as such, which is a concept that definitely we don't appreciate nowadays because of, again, many reasons I will not digress on now, and that you have been properly, say, indoctrinated to believe, because otherwise that would challenge yourself, right, in order to achieve like these individuals, right? So this was an elevation from your human condition. It could be achieved through essentially a spiritual accomplishment, because spirit is superior to matter, but matter is still part of, say, divinity, at least as a product of the fall, so that actually coming back to God entails the transfiguration through both natures. In fact, the spiritual and the physical one that are for this reason inextricably connected. Otherwise, we would believe that there is essentially not a lack of standard from your side, but essentially just, two guys that are fighting externally from you. This is what Gnostics fundamentally believe, and you wouldn't have even a purpose fundamentally, if not just as an accident, and without any capacity of your own, because in that case you would simply be maneuvered by these forces without any merit, right? And this latter interpretation, by the way, is what people normally prefer in their fall, in their degeneration, because of course it basically responsibilizes them and kills for good any possibility of transfiguration possible. It goes without saying, I'm just introducing these topics because, of course, we have talked already about these ideas, but it would be all a premise to do regarding the attainment capacity of humans in this moment in history. This is not just, you meditate and you save yourself or you succeed. It's a much more complex issue that, again, I can't quite deal with today, because I will stick to the topic here. But I also urge you to look at other videos of mine, especially the ones, in fact, in history and in the Indo-European religious interpretations and etc., because they are effectively the only ones that give you a dimension of how fallen is human nature, and how, in case you haven't understood already, what we went through in the last millennia can be measured, say, in through history of religions, but through politics. It's not, say, a matter of whatever you root with. If you do not have a concept of sacred properly established in a traditional sense, so basically anything you believe in, politics, your own, what you personally think religion is, which 99% of the time has nothing to do with this, right? Even though what we actually study religiously is loaded with that meaning. But again, it's just, as I always say, very often people who talk about occultism try to make appear the thing as an anti-Christian way, etc. This has nothing to do with that, right? Most people, from whichever religious background in the world today, do not have the palest idea of what the hell the religion actually means. But by any stretch of the imagination, nobody ever told them. This is not things that are taught to you by the world, in the world in which we live, nor the church, nor families, nor even less, of course, educational institutions do. At least I came through it mostly by myself, through things that were at least taught at some point and studied. Even in relatively recent times still, but it's something you have to work with for years and years, right? And it requires also a significant historical background, not just one in history of religions, which is very important, which is very different from, very often again, what you think religion is, right? History of religion is a serious thing, and it goes beyond whatever you think, what team, right, socially you're essentially faking to cosplay, right, without even knowing what that is, because that's what basically religion has become nowadays. And especially, I would say, with a lot of narcissism by those who are more ostensive about that. In any case, the point here is realizing what it meant for them in the past. Great part, of course, of history is recovering the original meaning, not what you interpreted like through your own age, but what they actually meant it was. And it's very complex to do. What we define here is the living and efficacious presence of a divine power, or a power that comes from above. Others would say from the within, because of the divine spark we were referencing before. In any case, this status is definitely superior in a metaphysical sense, and of course separates these individuals from the mass to a degree, because they are still human, right? And there wouldn't be a spark of divinity if humanity wasn't a form of fallen divinity. And that, however, in traditional societies were, of course, in fact, regarded with a status that was so elevated, like in the regal function, because of the possibility of this individual to transfigure the entire world, and so other people as well. This is the same reason why, say, in Christianity, for example, you think that Christ has transfigured the world, and so that effectively you have already been affected by this, especially if you are a Christian yourself, and that this fundamentally in the end time will bring to, at least in the classical, say, eschatological perspective, Judgment's Day, the sense that you will be elevated by, resuscitated by this force, and or, essentially making it to heaven or being dissolved into nothingness, which is the accurate idea of hell. And this entails, however, a sort of externality, right? For which, in fact, also what all these religions say, all religion has been criticized to a degree, in a traditional sense, in the measure in which you essentially think that all what is happening, what will happen in that regard, doesn't have to do with yourself, just per se. It's as if there were, of course, from the fall, a collective fate that you have imposed on yourself, and that you're called to break, but trying to making this whole humanity coming back to the one. And this must be achieved through the same work of humanity. This is also why, for example, the Holy Ghost cannot descend on you unless you are in the church. And this opens a very interesting, in fact, controversy regarding what is the actually eschatological. Of course, eschatologically speaking, the concept of time itself is also kind of non-existent. Right? In tradition, there is not such a thing like a time proper, nor a cyclical one, nor a one that doesn't have an eternal value in the very action, in any action, because everything that happens is part, right? Can happen only because it has been part of God, right? But of course, tradition tells also that, for example, at least there were two souls historically, one that would be able, that in fact the spirit that would be able to transfigure divinely, right, if managing to succeed in that, and a somatic one that would remain in all its sort of we can think it's still part of the same spirit, originary spirit, but that had fundamentally not managed to elevate itself to a degree, and was partly remaining on Earth together with essentially the soma of the clan, of the family, that was animated, but that would fundamentally also dissolve after a while, after roaming the Earth, right, for some time, hence ghosts, etc. Meaning exactly what? That just like in the constellations of deified heroes, etc., there is of course there is a degree of divinity, just like, I don't know, in Dante's comedy you have all the various heavens, right, approaching God, and the soul is able to reach some of those, depending on the shot, right? So that you would remain stuck in the firmament in the case of greatest heroes, saints, etc. But a part of it, right, would still somehow remain on Earth, and in the absence of a transfiguring force that can save humanity collectively, would disappear at some point. So even in the judgment in the end time, you in that case would have essentially, again, this eschatological linearity tells us still that it's basically the same. Like those who would be damned at that point are also the ones who couldn't make it in this life, as if there was a chronological division, but that's just a sort of misconception of properly the concept of time, either in a linear or in a cyclical sense. Now, one of these types of beings that we are, as you understand, talking about as kings is the Pontifex, right? So we're talking about ancient Rome, and so one of those cultures that felt the strongest the traditional sense of, in this case of Indo-European spirituality. We will be talking about many others, and there is still the issue of, speaking of the race of the gods, who were even the founders of various other civilizations, from China to Egypt, this is also yet another controversial thing that we will have to talk about at some other point. But I mean, it's no mystery that among the theories about the genesis, for example, of the king of the Chinese Empire, literally everything under heaven, that's what China means, there could easily be Indo-European dynasties, right? That is also something you can easily picture, even in the absence of explicit sources, by, for example, the spread of the war chariot exactly in the time, in the spaces affected by that. In any case, the Pontifex Maximus is one of the single most rigidly and brutally traditional figures in this regard. It is a magistracy, an office, whatever you want to call it, which is also sounds very secular and modern as a terminology, that, however, happened in a time that, of course, occurred after the Age of Kings. This is also not entirely correct, because Numa Marcius is, according to legend, and so later historiographical traditions, the first Pontifex Maximus in Rome, and appointed, by the way, by Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome. So this opens to many questions, because, of course, what we can document historiographically is one thing, and these legends were modified over time. And the other thing we can say, of course, is that the Pontifex, as we will understand now from the very etymology of the word, would have been Romulus, right? At least as the term Pontifex in Latin, and what we attribute to Rome in this sense. But of course, the term Pontifex, he who makes bridges, is a concept you find universally among all these various cultures, right? So the Roman terminology is also referring to the fact that throughout Roman history, the Pontifex Maximus was not just the highest religious office in Rome, but also as a magistrature, the magistrate who actually supervised the construction of bridges, right? And this is literally etymology. Pontum or pontes facere, that means to make a bridge, bridges. According to the inner meaning of the word, of course, we can find the relative etymology in the deeper meaning. As builder of bridges or of paths, all right, this guy would have indicated, right, essentially the medium between two dimensions, of course, the divine and the human one. Pons in ancient times also meant path in general, not just bridge, right, in Latin. And obviously Pons is connected with the Sanskrit pantha, that is this difficult path, from which also the Hellenic Pontus, so also the name given to the Black Sea as dangerous water, right, is referred to. And always remember that water is, of course, the most chthonic element, the most perilous, even the most opposite some religions, in fact, to the one of the deity of heaven, of thunder, the Godfather. So when you look at the Proto-Italic, you have root, you have in fact Pons, or also Ponts with the s at the end, and the Proto-Indo-European is Pontes. That is in fact path, road, from panth, path. Right, we've seen the Sanskrit pantha, the ancient Greek Pontus. In other, of course, languages, there was, say, also a different adaptation. For example, in Old Armenian, this was Hun, spelled Hun, which means a riverbed. But also the Old English Findan, from which the modern English find, actually has to do with this, because not just the bridge was to be built, and in that sense it always existed metaphysically, but of course in order to cross it had to be erected and owned by morally, right, by virtue of he who had to cross it. But of course the bridge led you to a, again, higher status, and so it's as if you had to find, essentially, the truth across it, right? The bridge has enormous anthropological meanings. It's also guarded by monsters that, of course, represents your inner demons that you must tame and slaughter, but in order to make them live within your regenerate self, right? And so elevating yourself to that status, you cannot essentially unexpose yourself to the darkest aspects of existence, right? The way of the left hand, the way where the fire of that blazes, and so the razor's edge, which a bridge can also essentially represent, because in these mythologies, by the way, the bridge could be very, very thin, right? For example, there is the Egyptian myth of, say, of the afterlife that, of course, refers to this quite difficult capacity of crossing, right, the path, because it would get very thin at some point, and you would have had to be just that good in order to be able to go across. But this is to be found in many. There are other legions, the one of the hearts that had to be lighter than a plume, etc., to avoid damnation, all this stuff. In any case, it all hints at this specific spiritual refinement and achievement that was the only one through which the Pontifex, and thus also the king, as we will see now, would have to rule through on the world. Now, in the fact that in Rome, that, as you know, got rid of kings at some point, maintaining this office of Pontifex, of course, shows you, as it would happen later on with what we call the empire in a monarchic sense, that the regal, right, royal prerogatives of, in fact, the ancient rulers were maintained in these offices that were now just redistributed among the Roman nobility. But the Pontifex was the most important charged office in Rome, and as such, it was also to properly navigate Rome into across the stormy waters. Because, of course, this was the closest guy to God, right, to Jupiter, and so the most important medium as far as anything spiritual was connected into this broader dimension. There was not just military, this is particularly important to stress now. I mean, war takes the form of also a metaphysical struggle, of course, so it can apply to the spiritual dimension, but the sense that you could, in theory, win the world just by visioning it, in a, say, spiritual sense, of course, think about the eye of Ra, simply molding the world through your own will, without even having to unseat this world, was the ultimate purpose of this all. And this is something which is strongly recovered by some, some critical religions to the level of decadence that the traditional, religion had taken, such as you pick Buddhism and Christianity, were all criticizing the fact that this higher standard of earthly power was not about much how, let's say, materially wealthy you were, which was definitely seen as one of the achievements, and one of the greatest achievements of earthly rulers, but that was nothing compared to God. Hence, also the mortification of many aspects of this power is not to be seen as an antithesis of the moral beliefs that originated, by the way, in extremely poor times, as you can imagine. I don't know, think about the Proto-Indo-Europeans, or later on, even for centuries, definitely not having the splendor of the greatest civilizations, but attaining the latter through this spiritual, accomplishment, but through very specific preparation, and that, however, would at some point also soften up and not being up to that standard really anymore. So the pons, the bridge connecting the natural and the supernatural dimensions. As we just said, the Pontifex was as such traditionally identified with the king, the rex, right? In Latin, from Proto-Italic rex, in turn from Proto-Indo-European rex, that means ruler, king, right? Cognates include the Sanskrit Rajan, the Rajas, right? The king. The Old Irish Ri, right? That is king. And of course, this has to do with the sense of rule, the Reich, the empire, as such, right? Because there is a difference between the empire and the the imperator and the rex, right? So between the empire and the regnum, because at least in modern times we came to think that the empire was simply in the feudal hierarchy, a sort of institution superior to the various realms. But of course the primal meaning is the one of the figure of the rex as essentially vicar of God on earth, right, if not the same person, essentially exercising their imperium, right? And so, of course, the Latin rex is a very different concept from, say, in archaic times, from the one it was used, say, in Middle Latin, right, during the Middle Ages. So that's how the word was gradually degenerating, but also in vocabulary, and that's something that we're all witnessing this very day, looking at the fact that literacy is essentially decreasing, right? So don't think about the absolute accomplishment of the fact that, of course, yes, way more people today than ever are literate, but the fact that the levels of literacy that are to be attained are sinking, as a matter of fact. So it's not just knowing how to read, it's also how to exercise your linguistical capacity. Servius, a late 4th century commentator on Virgil's works that naturally were soaked all into this highest understanding. Again, read the Aeneid, read Virgil, because you literally find explicitated the same meanings, right? It's not even so arcane as a journey, right? You would read an article about Virgil from, I don't know, JSTOR, whatever, and hardly anyone talks about these things, while the obvious sense of all these texts revolved around this ancestral wisdom. In any case, Servius, again, this late Roman author, commenting on Virgil, says, quote, "The custom of our ancestors was that the king should also be Pontifex and priest." Right, so the thing is pretty clear, like the king, except of course the guy is talking from a time, is using terms here that are used to make you understand, but that, say, nobody at the time he's talking about would have expressed in this way. The king was ipso facto by himself, so this would have applied to Romulus par excellence, and to any of these beings, in that case, capable of essentially transcending divinely, were provided, again, with the capacity of, in fact, officiating the religious priestly rituals, but in this sense as a pontifex, literally leading the subjects towards this other dimension, and that was the actual meaning of that. In Latin, you have the term dux, which literally stems etymologically from the verb that means leading, right? But that essentially describes yes, it's also metaphysically connected, but it's a sort of physical function, right, of literally leading the way. This one is the guy that literally creates such bridge between God and earth. This is extremely important. Again, the Pontifex is the one who makes the bridge, who erects them. And as such, so someone who precedes the same victorious leader, right? Or at least he should be the same person. And you understand even in Rome how this had split functions over time because of the fall of human standards. A saying of the Norse tradition reads, "May our leader be our bridge." Right? Recorded in the later Celtic Welsh tradition of the Mabinogion reads, quote, "May our leader be our bridge." Now, this is fascinating. The Mabinogion, by the way, is essentially a collection of tales and romances, right? So it's definitely important for the information in traditional Indo-European regality. The tales are mainly concerned with the heroic exploit of the various Welsh kings and king groups. Consider that the Welsh, as you know, in their national and nationalistic rhetoric have a Romano-Brittonic understanding of things. So I don't think there is a way to philologically connect in a direct way the reference to the bridge that we just quoted to the Roman Pontifex from imperial times, but it's still fascinating because it is still referred to in this broader, say, Brittonic, say, background or cycle literature to such ancestral meanings in times that are rather talking about heroic adventure, courtly love, chivalry, and sacrifice that are, of course, expressed in the later souls of the times, but that are, of course, talking, like the entire epos of medieval romance, about those traditional, say, important aspects of traditional Indo-European regality, and that should be considered further also in other, in fact, medieval literary traditions as such, as I explained also in some other video. And we will talk about this, for example, as far as the Ghibelline Middle Ages go, but the entire meanings were fundamentally still understood at the time in the traditional way. The interesting thing is that in medieval times, there weren't, of course, the historical and philological means that would allow these traditions to, say, remain explicitly connected with the actual understanding, because not even from ancient times, people would know, but just by recognizing the universal value for what it was. So just they were living by that, right? So be very careful about this, because from a couple of 100 years we do not have this anymore. And of course also the so-called traditional cultures, or sort of more of, say, primitive ones, to be very frank, have also forgotten that. Right, there is this sort of delusion of, say, underdeveloped countries to pretend that they are safeguarding tradition, when actually, aside from the various, very often socialistic backgrounds, but sometimes also religious integralistic ones, they have cancelled any trace of that. Right, the fact that you leave under texts that are that you don't even understand fundamentally, because you can't if you don't have this specific background and education, it's doing literally nothing about this. That's why I actually think that, in fact, what is left of tradition is present only in the West, right? And that's the reason why, by the way, the West had risen to such heights throughout in the millennia. But it's not just about that. It's properly about the recognition of certain values that we kept on cultivating, while other peoples basically just sclerotized into some sort of non-recognition of any traditional value whatsoever. It's as if, you ask about the traditional roles of different, I don't know, for example, of the sexes, etc. If you ask a traditional society, it's not because they can actually explain to you why that's the case, right? They don't picture it. Right, so what's the value of it anyway, right? When you especially realize that in those cultures, like, of course, there is a dramatic misery at every level, and definitely not a spiritual elevation of any sort, and that very often this is an incredibly fucked up, abusive system that, of course, goes against value of power and achievement that tradition is exclusively about. So when we reflect on this bridging function and bridge making function of the ancient kings, we realize that real monarchs were intended as properly the steadfast personification of the life beyond ordinary life, or at least beyond what ordinary life had, as I just exemplified, began to forget about these meanings, or distancing further through the forever going full from the awareness of the sacred in the heart of man. So beneficial spiritual influences used to radiate upon the world of mortal beings from the mere presence of such men. This is a concept you still find in as late as, in the times of Augustus, where, again, the traditional value of the princeps stemmed from the fact that he didn't have, in fact, to present any other outer characteristic, as it would happen later, was already happening in the Hellenistic worlds in the forms, of the proskuneses or any other kind of say, magnification, exterior magnification of monarchic power. Just the other day, I was making about I was talking about this in that video about the 2nd century AD Roman imperial culture, and observing how that had changed gradually, because this always goes across time in a more or less unavoidable way. Actually, Augustus, according to Roman tradition, is the one who reversed things, at least as the culminating apex of all I think that had been going on in Rome since the very beginning. But again, the sense there was something supernatural about these individuals that Cicero could observe by talking to, because he was sort of his political opponent, but they knew each other, were friends, etc. As a divine character, as the fact that, in fact, even the relatively modern secular Cicero, to be more precise, in the 1st century BC, could look at Cicero and says, this guy, I don't like him politically, but he has something that other men don't have, right? He's a quasi-god. He says that, right? I explained again in that video that is crucial about the Fortuna Kaiser, is practically, I don't know, I've been studying Roman history for decades in my life, and nobody had ever explained me until I came across it. And you may want to let the world know that these things happen, and of course the whole deal of what the Fortuna Kaiser is there metaphysically was supposed to mean, also in function of Augustus, of course in a divine, supernatural sense. Well, that's the point, right? The idea of the same empire was that through such power, humanity would be transfigured. It's the same reason why Christians believe providentially that Christ was born under Augustus. And it's the simple meaning of munus and, say, manumission, of liberation, the one of earning of the Roman citizenry, etc. That is beautifully expressed, in fact, in the aforementioned Virgilian work as the sort of civilizing, evangelic, universal mission of Rome entrusted to her by God himself. So the pontifical mediation, if we can talk about this, that was, remember, at least if we stick to the Roman background here, was a function, right? That's what the term means, right? It stems from the verb of bridge building. From the power of the rites that were rendered efficacious by their power, and from the institutions of which they were the center. So of course the king creates a realm, right? He has an empire, and he molds this, right? Always remember that in tradition, what matters is, of course, both the substance and the form, but the form is superior, is the spiritual element that gives, in fact, form, it gives an order. We'll see now the age of order, and I made a video about that in the Romano-Celto-Germanic tradition, to the substance that otherwise by itself would simply not would be not put together to make sense, to be more than the sum of its parts, right? Form, spirituality, instead increases this. It carries out a miracle, which is exactly the one also of augmentation, from which the term augere and Augustus, that is also connected with the Hellenic sebastos, actually means. It is the one of increasing life, actually, of enlarging it, of making it more powerful, and so essentially winning over darkness, over death, over degeneration, over decline, and in this sense really bridging the distance between God and mankind, right? And reflecting this, because it's the same thing we were saying before, that the Holy Ghost, so Spirit, cannot descend on the community, on the church, on the state, on the institution, if there is no such a thing on earth, right? There are a lot, say, we are worldwide witnessing the sense that the average, I would add lesser person, believes that essentially tearing apart order, right? Whether it's a leftist who thinks that, I don't know, everything is systemically racist and so evil, or a right-wing populist who pretends that since again there is somebody that you don't like in power, everything that your state does as a consequence must be sabotaged by essentially cutting your own attributes in the process. And of course, it's National Socialism. Just to break it down to you, people still don't understand that even though there is a difference between nationalism and socialism, there cannot be the one without the other. This happens from the times in which we killed tradition. Mass society, fourth estate in power, there is the sense that there is a fixed standard belonging to a community that, of course, is not holy, and especially doesn't have anything close to leading the world, which is the only way a community can prove to be above actually the others. Pretends that the standard of this community, just being born there without any factual accomplishment of any kind, is endowed with any trace of human dignity whatsoever. Thus, the next step, of course, of nationalism in socialism, because at that point, if you have that tag on you, you just want because you think that you're entitled even though you haven't accomplished anything, and the next step from socialism is communism. And so there is actually nothing flattering about having this flattened horizontal idea of left and right, because it means you're not able to look up, right? And you're just looking at the surface, so at the bottom, and you're sinking further, and essentially being just a mirror of your opponent, right? Remember this: if you come from a place where the left is wild and raging and in power and crazy, it's because the other side is made up of lesser people who cannot afford to defeat that, right? So there's this sense in conservatism nowadays that, you just being yourself is okay. That's the criminal, mortal mistake that destroys humanity in itself. There is nothing worth in being a human unless you actually acquire divine capacity. Just saying I want to be left alone is not a human value, right? It's just weakness at the most exponential level. You're just a passive being that gives for granted something that is evidently not able to accomplish, remaining with the only option of sabotaging the same boat that is bringing you in a way or another somewhere, and that you let somebody else hijack. And in tradition, there is no room for, let's say, the evil guy, again, that is evil in the sense that is weaker than you, but he has more power on earth than you, right? If somebody has more power on earth than you, it's because that's better than you, right? This is not to say, of course, in our systems that, again, necessarily the guy at the top is better than you individually because you're not at the top. Actually, most of the cases, that is because those qualities are really greater than whatever you had there to naturally wanting to arrive at that point, or at least somewhere close to that. But, of course, it's distributed in general across society. And, again, the traditional understanding of this is that you are the only one who is capable of bringing that divine power on you if you are worth of it. And at that point, simply, you will be able to, right? It will simply happen. There is not even in here such a cause-consequence effect. You have, in a sense, there is, because, of course, spirit, being superior to matter, has to work this out. So there is this sort of time, again, that we understand as such, that has to make you grow, etc. And there is all a process of cultivation that should bring you there. But again, in the last couple of hundred of years, even the awareness that this thing is real in a moral as scientific sense, and I'm talking about the hard scientific sense, right? This is not wishful thinking. This is real, and they understood it at the time, has been completely erased. Because again, any sense that you should make an effort in a society ruled by fourth estaters who had been living for millennia just under the heel of somebody else because of their unaccomplishment, of course cannot provide but this sense that everything that pertained to the fourth estate was normality in its inferiority, and that today you're not even capable of distinguishing from anything else. Hence the death of standards, the death of life, the death of everything, right? And increased risk of self-destruction, which is exactly what this is all about, right? And the risk of self-destruction is, however, still necessary in order to spiritually elevate, right? But this does not entail at all the undermining of civilization, because civilization so far has been the only mean that we've, and so the cause of it, and so the actual accomplishments of people and their increasing power, the only way to bridge from the fall the distance between us and God. Surely a different way, one may think from, I don't know, the one they had thousands of years ago, nevertheless something that could never work without spiritual attainment. There's no such thing like we're more powerful now because we have technology. Because technology came, aside from technology, it doesn't basically do anything. We invent technology for making something that we already have work better, and essentially that's it in the world of civilization. But in order to attain that knowledge, we had to go through things, right, that made us realize that that was the functional thing. And that can still be considered traditional, because again, otherwise it would not work. And that's what people mostly get wrong about modernity. Modernity does not exist, right? Essentially, everything that has been working and would call modern is still a part of tradition. And when things will go worse, is because our spiritual dimension will come short of that, and not because an external event has brought us down. There is no such thing in tradition like room for somebody else did it, hence it's their fault, I have no responsibility. Whatever happens to you, and I mean literally every single damn thing, physically and metaphysically, is on you. And there is no way to change that, right? Unless you do. That is to rule the world, which ancient peoples had obviously in pretty clear in mind. Together, the average so-called traditionalist is a guy that thinks that being for spending a lifetime at the margins of society is, without accomplishing anything in the process, not even say like a moment of ascetic, say revival, in order to come back to the world and do stuff in the traditional way, is supposed to be an actual existence. Well, those are the ones we will dissolve after, right, spiritually. And there will be no trace of, because that's the measure of it, right? And again, spiritually, you could win the world even by doing this, but eventually this is not happening. Nobody is fixing that from that position, simply because they don't know how to do it, which is also quite simple and not just self-evident. But again, the concept that institutions are, of course, more important, right, in the meaning that they have in order to be attained, is central, because God is more important than anything else. There is nothing outside of it, right? And institutions are meaning to come closer to it. So tearing them apart is sacrilegious, right? And unless, of course, they fail by themselves, which still may happen because somebody, because they sank in standard, so that there are, of course, institutions that fail and that fortunately do so, but because there is something else that can come, and or they were not able to hold because the entire system was just too low, right? So that's a moment in which self-sabotage actually can cause a civilizational collapse without alternative, right? This is going to be a tragedy for everybody involved, and there is nothing to rejoice about. So what is important to stress is about this institutional dimension is that there is a collective function of leaders in this, not a collectivistic, learn the most elementary linguistic difference between something called something and the ism of it, right? If you national doesn't mean nationalist, right? Social doesn't mean socialist. But people switch these things all the time because they literally do not understand their own languages. And as I always say, the West is definitely the most advanced, educated, intelligent part of the world, but don't think that more than a few points percentage of Westerners actually have a satisfactory first world primary schooling by actual Western standards, and the ones we attained, right? Not the ones that teachers in school today do. And I actually have a great respect for the institution itself, because some things do work, so I don't go to the other extreme either. That is apparently that in order to be a conservative today, you must be a radically underschooled ignorant that doesn't even study humanistic subjects because he's whining about some Marxists teaching them, right? That's, again, your inferiority speaking, not any kind of divine worth whatsoever in you. Now, the influences that the king here is able to spread through the institution of monarchy, or however the system worked, by the way, permeated people's thoughts, intentions, and actions. People lived in a much more dramatically intense way, pretty much everything. But politics, we would be surprised by how dominating it actually was in their actions, right? In their spirituality, in their religion, right? Sometimes I smile when I hear people, like even in, just recently in some allegedly Roman history channel say things like, I don't know, Christianity ended, the separation of state and church. What about exactly the opposite? That is not actually a good thing, in the sense that, of course, up to that point, the state had held, because there were rulers who were thought, again, to some, the function of king and the highest priest, fundamentally. Up to that point, there was a civilizational collapse, and simply Christianity collected what was left of it, saying, okay, let's make these things work right now. Let's develop this function that is spiritual one, the sacerdotal one, and let's comfort the secular, let's say, lay power, and try to work together to make things work back again, because this thing has literally broken to pieces, and that's the only way to come closer back to God. And that's what essentially the Holy Roman Empire was meant to be. The Byzantines, for example, went on with the older model because they held. But there you have still one example of sclerotization, where, yes, there was some value there, no doubt, but also no capacity eventually to withstand the accomplishments of a system like the Western one that managed to overrun them. So bear it in mind, because this struggle, the conflict, is toughening up. From crisis, you're supposed to draw this further push, but it's not necessarily going to be enough. That's why, again, destroying the institution is sinful in itself, because the institution has sinned if it happens, because it's not been up to the task, and it had that one that had the greatest responsibility. But accelerating this process, right, trying to undermine everything, to destroy everything, it's also just to say, okay, we will raise this to the ground, so we'll build it better. It's just stupid. It's just like saying, I don't know, I arrived to the last word of my 4 years long doctoral thesis. I don't like it, and say, okay, now I will delete it. I will rewrite it from zero. No, you go with that, even if it's imperfect, and you start working on that, you improve. And that's what civilization is. It looks pretty much like putting patches, patch after patch, let's say, on everything that doesn't work, and it can appear as clumsy as it does, because we are really a fallen kind, and that's the result. But that pile will be able to withstand much more than the sum of all those patches will, right? And that's the entire point of tradition. Then there is the question, again, of can we make it alone? What's this all about? But if you believe, again, in the transfigurational force of the spirit, you know that's the only way to go. And that, yes, there could be in theory a way to simply not have put any patch at all, to destroy the pile and simply make it, but it's out of sheer spiritual capacity. But it's way more difficult, and the reason why tradition is called tradition, from Latin, which of course means to pass down generation after generation, is that we preserve this knowledge in order to equip our descendants with the best insight available, and we fail, right? Because at some point, like at every step of the way, we somehow forget. We somehow say, "Oh well, yeah, I remember that, but sorry, now I forgot to pass it down," and then it gets lost. People die, and at some point, the newer generations say, "Even what is tradition?" Because I don't even understand what it technically is, right? It's like you ask a Generation Z average person, like what like even the basics, like what was, the Iliad, or and it's just it's not like they know, but they have heard. Like, they literally don't have the pinnacle idea of what the hell that is. They have lost the actual terms of comparison, right? So it's, as I was saying before, it's not just substance. It's not just a shower of endless shower of information you can get from the internet. It's learning how to put together this stuff so that it stands, right, and works. And that's a completely different thing that only our institutions can preserve, and definitely not the average guy from history, because it definitely was proven historically that's not how the average human works, even though they could have the potential. The royal influence was literally intended monetistically, right? The sense of touch or proximity, the fact that this was a human but also a god, is at the root of all the sense. For example, the relics of the permanence of a spirit in the soma at the grave. This is present basically in every culture, and it was understood, of course, in a metaphysical sense. And this influences also made propitious the general conditions for prosperity, health, and good fortune, as a matter of fact. That's why, for example, again, in the general decline of sacral awareness, still there were so many different deities that had been so fragmented, like for every single minimal aspect of daily life, that they didn't make any sense. And were so minimal, and the sacrifice so just, say, pro forma, that there was no spiritual attainment there. And that's where also, again, movements like Buddhism and Christianity emerged from backgrounds that were fiercely about this. We still have to talk a lot about Christianity, because I've never heard, like, it's full of now, of, at least if you are on the conservative side of YouTube, of all suggested videos about a case for Jesus, like, this allegedly expert theologians still trying to make sense of why, I don't know, Transfiguration or resurrection are the actual deal. They just know the little story from the gospel, and they don't understand how big it is and how macroscopically so it is, just by having a traditional background, by actually knowing all the story. If you still parochially reason, like, that's just my thinking, I don't even study other religions, so that I don't know comparatively the extent by which this was believed at the time, then what's even the point of you calling yourself a religious person? It's just blasphemy at best, right? So in the world of tradition, the most important foundation of the authority and of the right, the use in Latin of kings and chiefs, and the reason, as you understand, why they were obeyed, feared, and venerated as well, was essentially their transcendent, their transcendent and non-human quality. In other words, they weren't praising the human as such, or only as such, but the divine dimension that he had been able to attain, right? The term use is quite meaningful because, of course, in Latin it had a very sacred meaning. Today we think about juridical stuff saying, okay, it's just law, right? It's just what, bureaucrats do on paper. It's weird. It's just a very secularized, modernized mechanism, etc. But the use, right, in Latin, derived from the Proto-Italic iovos and from the Proto-Indo-European hiva, an extended form of the root he, the source of aevum and juvenis, which, as you know, as we've seen in that video about the Romano-Celto-Germanic sense of the age of order, had to embody this sense of transfiguration, of rejuvenation, of rebooting, in a sense, in a metaphysical way, and so in a spiritual one. So still aided by the vestiges of what had been left. It could be also the institution, but being reinvigorated in a spiritual way. In other words, without that moral dimension, you couldn't make any institution work. So this doesn't mean that the institution is evil per se, right? It's people were not up to it. In any civilizational failure is exclusively not just the failure of one or two persons or whoever is just in charge, but the one of every single human being. Because if you were not better than those who were in charge, then you were only worse. And so in front of the infinity of your divine potential, you failed worse, right? So aevum, so the age, and juvenis, the youth, the sense of the cycle of virginity, of spring, of in fact creation and recreation, was the one that kings and chiefs in general embodied, right? This has also a racial meaning, of course, because it speaks of the say again of the degree by which you are fallen, which is essentially the way you are incarnated. And so the qualities that background brought, right, that are not, as we have seen, more important than the spirit, but that the spirit is obviously connected to that. So free will, you can actually carry that out. The reason why free will is discarded by many scientists today is simply the concept of, if something is not demonstrated, it's not that I don't know whether it exists or not, but it must not exist by any reason, because otherwise somebody will start thinking that, maybe everything is possible and we can attain it, right? So at least this is not true for all scientists, but generally speaking so, because that's how it happened. Science has been hijacked by anti-traditionalists that want to, of course, distract you from any spiritual matter just by telling you that it's pure mechanism, even though there is no actual evidence for that either, right? That's the only thing that people see, but not understanding how it, at the end of the day, any of this works, starting from life, conscience, literally nobody has any idea of that. And so that we could be a bit more humble about. But this is exactly what instead the ancients were obeyed of, right? Because the way you would relate yourself with this leader was also the one that would make the difference in yourself, right? Obeying, fearing, venerating, but it was also resistance. It was also, of course, an idea that you were not just to be prostrated, prone to this guy. You could have technically the capacity of surpassing him, and as a consequence rendering good service to the entire humanity in the process, right? And training your capacity of leadership, and so being able to supersede others, and so ideally, right, keeping on with this constant improvement, which is essentially the only way that humanity has to escape total the abyss, right? And ultimate death, the real one, the one after which there is no such thing like an afterlife. And this aspect, say, why would leaders were obeyed, feared, and venerated, is something which today we do not understand anymore, unless in an artificial way, right? I believe that, I don't know, at least 3/4 of adults believe that, institutions are there to just take advantage of you, right? Against any civilizational evidence. Again, people may take advantage of you, but the sense that, again, you should have higher standards, which of course the institution represents, is something, of course, that the average fourth estater cannot afford to accept, as many other things, because that would show him the degree of his fall, right? As a consequence, the institution as a mean, not as a superstition, means also that those who are at the top are not artificially so, right? But they are actually powerful. They are actually real in this, and to be feared as a consequence, right? Which is something that, of course, you can and you will experience in relation just of how powerful you are, right? Totalitarian regimes, for example, are extremely weak, right? And extremely weak are the peoples that are under totalitarian regimes. Totalitarian regimes, dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, all spread among lesser peoples, culturally, humanly, morally, right? Because only such weak people can essentially decide to be under someone that can make them live in such squalid form of, say, degeneration. And everybody who lives from the other side knows from the outside how weak these regimes are, and so how stupid are the people who live in those countries. But those people do not understand that, because they're so weak that they literally think that that's a real thing, that's how, that's the potential of a civilization. In spite of all the microscopical evidence of, living an abominable amount of less years compared to somebody living in another country, or being extremely poor, or illiterate, or an idiot, and surprise, surprise, not having any idea what the hell sacred tradition is, right? These kind of regimes emerged again within the last couple of hundred, the last 100 years. They were essentially atheistic, socialistic or national socialistic, and so what I was just describing before, guess why? Right? The funny thing among, instead, the lesser people that live in the more advanced countries, that they think that these are sort of pools of tradition, when they're notoriously some of the most atheistic realities, right? And even the fundamentalistic religious regimes, they are appallingly ignorant in religion. They literally do not know anything about that, right? They just force them into formally, behaving in a way, and I intend here formally just, pro forma, not in a sense they are given a form in that way, and then essentially not getting anywhere with that anyway. And power is really always the same issue there. If it is not there, it means that the world is not traditional. And that world is not traditional. This is, I think, a radically important and diametrically opposite notion that the one that the average person literally thinks today. The thing that authority is mocked is both the cause and the consequence of the decline that we're witnessing, meaning that, of course, that authority will be that low for this reason. But if you realize how people lived millennia ago, realize that they literally feared rulers in a way that is unknown to us, but not because their fear was not was about servilism, as a matter of fact, rulers were so appreciated, in part because these societies were in need of them, because of the much higher threats and the fact that life was much cheaper, so much easier to lose than before, and civilization helped in fixing that, so you should appreciate it traditionally. But they understood, they were much more directly wired with the consequences of their political behavior, and they recognized in such achievements the presence of an investment, right, of natural and absolute sovereign power by God, right? So the more people acknowledge the ontological rank of what was prior and superior to the visible and temporal dimension, the more these rulers were effective, as a matter of fact. Right? This is the extraordinary thing, that by realizing, only when you realize that earthly power is God-given, and that you can actually get it, because the only source of power is from God, you suddenly discover the meaning of life, per se, not just immediately like this. You have, again, to cultivate that capacity and actually to attain that power in order to have a rise to that spiritual status that allows you to recognize such things and immediately translate it into actual power. And we know this also from just behavioral, evolutionary biology, from just the way humans literally are designed to act, right, genetically. The fact, for example, that we're attracted to chaos because we want to actually make order out of that. Remember the Ivan, remember the use, right, law. That's why law exists. It doesn't exist to, just piss you off because you have to pay for someone else. If you do, it's because evidently you're not so powerful or convincing or intelligent, capable to but to complain on social networks for whichever restriction you are, barking about, but really doing nothing about, which seems to be extremely common nowadays, right? Traditional civilizations, thus unlike those of the decadent and later times, completely ignored the sense that the supreme authority was a merely earthly one, a merely secular one. In other words, politics was not understood like we do today in the rape that we have made also the ancient Greek understanding of it, which was traditional originally, and say as a sort of, activity that somebody does here because we have to do, and it's actually boring, and I don't really understand it, but it exists. Well, that's exactly the condition that makes you completely telling about your ignorance regarding spiritual matters. Because if you had any value, any standard, any capacity, you would intervene dramatically in that dimension. And you wouldn't think that you're just, essentially a bowl of meat that is going to live 70 or 80 years or so and then to rot away without any purpose. Right? And that's actually scary too, which is the reason why everybody, of course, was trying to escape that, through such divine attainment. But also for the people you love. And love actually was the foundational value of all this. These were radically, brutally, traumatically, unspeakably violent societies, but they also expressed literally the highest, in fact, artistic forms, moral, in fact, truly divine ones that we know, and that speak a language that we can still recognize, and especially through art, through conveying feelings, let's say, that are the ones that have to put you in motion, and that you will have to teach how to yourself to use, to wield, as powerful as they are, by developing reason, and so to support their flow. There is also another importantly subtle passage in this. What, let's say, relevance did things like strength, violence, or natural and secular qualities such as intelligence, wisdom, physical courage, and also the sort of minute concern for the collective material well-being, right, in the roots of authority, were they just per se the measure of the accomplishment of a ruler or not? Well, in spiritual sense, per se, they weren't. This distinction is very important. I mean, these are just material attainments. They do not show essentially what is at the root of that necessarily, right? It's just like the concept that we sin with the mind and not with the physical action, which is a very fair, in fact, and truly traditional concept, because what really brings to action is exclusively life. There's no other known thing, right? At least the laws of nature work because of some force that was impressed originally, and we don't know, or we don't at least admit what it is. But the only capacity that exists to counter that lays in life, and in will, and in action. This means that, as I was saying before, it doesn't matter how earthly powerful a politic was, but this doesn't tell you, exactly because it's measured through an earthly, that is finite, achievement, maybe a very great spiritual force, but it is not so big as God is. So in other words, yes, you can be content of everything that civilization has produced because it has improved the situation, and that's why we have to be thankful towards civilization anyway. And if anything, complaining about the fact that we're not up to it, right? And so the accomplishment of our ancestors in reflecting why we aren't, which is obviously the reason of a spiritual degeneration that occurred because not of something that is being passively impressed on us, but because something that we couldn't react functionally to. And so that is always our fault, right? That's where most people, again, will start blaming civilization, right? They think that was a state of nature in which everything was better, right, after the fall. There wasn't, right? And the same reason why we exist in the way we do and why we suffer, etc. We dramatically reduce that because of our accomplishment. And the fact that we can't handle that after such accomplishment, it's just self-evidently because we're not strong enough individually, and we are the only active force out there. We can act just because it's successfully because our vision of it is in synchrony with divine order, and so that we're just making it match, and simply at that point there will not be any attrition, there will not be any friction, any obstacle to take over everything. In other words, every effort we make, and the reason why this is a form of effort is because we are doing something wrong that we impressed ourselves in the moment of the fall. Right? We decided to be mortal, we decided to fear. In other words, from a condition of immortality, we started toying paranoidly with the concept of mortality of ourselves. And here we are, making it happen through our own sinful nature that we impress to ourselves. So the roots of authority have always a metaphysical character as a consequence, right? And in any ruler that could not bring us back to God functionally, of course we can spot a fault, and we can spot, of course, the human nature of the human limits of, right? But that's also the guy who has everything on his shoulders. This is what the elite truly has. Those who rule have the entire responsibility of everyone on their shoulders, in a way or another, if they succeed as if they don't. Because everything has to revert, right, to the, has to come back to you, in a way or another. So the idea that the power to govern is conferred on the chief by those whom he rules, and that this authority is the expression of the community and therefore subject to its decrees, was foreign to tradition as well. Because the sense is that even though people participated to the civilizational achievement, this still needed a medium. And of course, the ruler was not the entire medium, right? But the one that was at the top, that was essentially more than everybody else, and that therefore had the greatest responsibility of all in relative terms. So that you can have actually, and you should have in this sense, cultures in which power is shared in virtue, in fact, of the capacity of the people who make up this community. And again, people attack the concept of democracy, which is objectively a very bad word, because demos means fourth estate, and so it's rightfully hated as a word. But in fact, democracy is not the democracy we intend. It is, in theory, in part the benefit of the doubt that sometimes is definitely too tolerant, that everybody can have that value and power, but definitely that would be better. I would like to live in a world in which people are better. That's what we really would all like. It's a bit scary when you understand also the dark side of power, which is the one of the abuse, for which if everybody's weaker than you can rule them, you can manipulate them, etc. Well, yes, that's their fault, definitely, but you're also not helping. It's as if you were the one who was sabotaging the entire system. And this is definitely what happens. This is definitely what you can blame a government for, at least in line of principle. But the question is always come back to you. They said, where were you when this was happening? Who did make you think that you were just delegating your own power to somebody else? Don't you have a conscience? Don't you have a responsibility? Don't you have a capacity? And say, well, I'm just a man. Well, that's exactly the problem. We are a fallen kind. And you have the spiritual potential to be much greater than that. Where were you then? And you, at that point, you must accept your own fault. You must accept the fact that, of course, any single governmental decision is always the fault of every single person that inhabits that polity, right? Only fourth estaters will invent the notion that there is the terrible leader, and that the rest of the population are all angels and lambs, that we're just obeying orders after all, right? This is a typically fourth estater, nationalist and or socialist delusion, right? This is what if you ask somebody from the Eastern Bloc, like, that's literally the thing that they think. No, it's not my fault. It's that guy at the top. I don't have anything to do with that. Well, you're actually a citizen of that country. What are you actively doing to stop that? Of course, nothing. And that's also why you live the way you do, in comparison to the West. Well, that's exactly the entire thing. I mean, as I explained in that video titled, in fact, on the Soviet abomination of mankind, exactly what that ideology, which is anti-traditional, revolves around. Stripping man of humanity. This is what communism does. This is what National Socialism does, because it's always socialism at the end of the day. It's always that degenerative last fourth estate or superstition that the lesser people think is the excuse for others not looking at how fallen they are, right? And that's what they are addicted to. I mean, our entire world is addicted to this concept. Not look at my fault, because otherwise I will have to work, right? And instead, laziness is ruling, rather. There is no tradition in failure. If you lose, it's because somebody is better than you. And there is nothing that you could do about that. There is something you can do about that if you're still alive, but the rhetoric of the lost cause, that's yet another, those guys fought, they were heroes because they couldn't win, but they fought anyway because they had higher standards. Yes, high standards that made them lose. So how does that work in a world dominated by moral force? Right? Nobody really understands that, right? And that is permeable. That's how we defeat countries. That's how we crush enemies. We kill them morally, right? We don't. This passes through destruction, physical destruction, but it doesn't mean that physical destruction is just poking a stone. There is no life in that, right? Humans work in a very different way, and so any also deterministic approach to history is obviously used to say, okay, well, you can't point fingers saying, but that guy who won was actually the bad guy. How exactly? Right? Yes, maybe he was a bad guy, but he was better definitely than the guy that he defeated. And also the quantitative approach doesn't hold, because of course there are systems that are much larger than crush smaller ones, but the point is that who did create those smaller policies, and why didn't they extend over larger amount of people if their values were superior to the one of the bigger system? This is, I think, quite important, and tradition goes a lot that back and forth in science, because again, the bigger system could win, but it could do that, and that's important with leadership, and or of whoever, the establishment, who actually rules, because you could you dominate over a system in which the single individuals are qualitatively inferior to the other, but still making it to bring together more force over more people than the ones who are resisting. And if the others are not really intervening there, the problem there stands in the fact that those who were taken out were not enough for the level of power that needed to be exercised, and rule is always challenged. So that it's never a static system for which, again, there is just a sort of blob that takes over everything, and the more it swallows, the stronger it becomes. And so the world by this point should have been just ruled by a single guy. Instead, the sense that, of course, we are increasingly more fragmented because, at least compared to ecumenic empires of the ancient world, and there were backs and forths in this regard in the history of civilization, but gradually the trend is to decline, to the fragmentation. Well, the question is, at least if we don't succeed traditionally, the question is, again, whose fault is that, if not our own, right? Because we didn't even try at some levels, and that's actually something that the only way we can explain all of this anyway. This sense that power is given by God, this is also crucial. For example, in the Hellenic mythology, Zeus is the one who bestows the Themistes on kings of divine origin, whereby Themis, or law from above, is very different from what constitutes instead the norm, the nomos, which is the political law of the community. This distinction is fundamental because the first one is the actual power conferred. The second is the one which fundamentally is just provided as a, in fact, as a law, right, but not enforced or not successfully presented by the virtue of the leader to be successfully followed, so that everything comes short. And of course, all human law is sort of nomos, right? While the Holy Ghost, the Nika, the Imperium, it would be the Themis in this regard. Themis means also law, custom. I mean, of course, here there is also a different traditional view of how that was. While the Indo-European etymology of nomos is named, is to assign, to allot, also to take, right? In this sense, the nomos can also be taken by somebody else. Again, if you manage to overthrow the ruler and somehow through a law that is the same one that he affirmed, let's say, and that eventually you're able to make win over him. That means, of course, the ruler is weak, but you could have, through such assignation, still the capacity of handling it. However, just to make you understand how the nomos is somehow passively received, so by somebody that initially doesn't have that divine power to act at least as a medium with the divinity that would confer the Themis, not just, of course, nomos is cognate with English numb, the Dutch name and the German name, but also the Albanian nye, which stands for count in order to assign, to allot, to distribute, but also neme, which means curse. So in other words, it's as if he who has the Themis, the law from the above, assigns it to people, so that basically also makes people working on his behalf as if he were God, but failing because he's actually just a human. So God, yes, gives him this law, but he gives it in not necessarily an absolute way that would confer him divine power to the same extent of God, right? So just to the degree that eventually this guy will likely mishandle because he's fallen, and so the others that received this are, in a sense, they are blessed in the process which they technically received it for their own virtue, but they are also cursed because as long as at least this guy is in power, this law will objectively rule over them. And if they're not enough to be better than this guy, then that evidently as any politician cannot be perfect unless he's God himself, they will suffer, so they will be cursed by, and so they will subjected to without that degree of divine dignity that this, to a greater degree, the ruler had. This is particularly important. Reflect on it, because that's what we were saying before about the superiority of the elite. You cannot rule any country if you do not get the decisive moral superiority over them. And in this sense, they're same one, because there is a consonance with their own spiritual power as well in order to be obeyed, which can also manifest in passivity, because still that requires some sort of active obedience. On the other side, but this means, of course, that the elite is superior to the others, and this is in fact the only traditional view that you can hold. It's the same concept of the Clausewitzian Trinity. Politics embodies the most reasonable element of the entire society. So if you think that your politicians are unreasonable, just know that you say your people is not, right, and that you're not enough to be more powerful than that guy, even if you were better or worse than him in something else. This, of course, should be seen not in a monolithical sense, as if there was just a state, a politics. Many people, many adults actually believe in such made-up reality, in which they don't understand, of course, that everything that happens also from the other side of the world has an effect on you and vice versa. So you can come to guide even a revolution or whatever, or just being influential enough to cause big changes that may be bigger than the one of some, say, heads of state. But ruling actively is also substantiated in very specific ways that will take form in reality, and so you can't quite be a relativist about that either, right? And as we said, in conditions in which you're poorly ruled, still the idea of, I'm just a private citizen, it's not my fault, it is the greatest form of relativism that you can imagine if you believe that what you're fighting for is sacred and so infinitely valuable, and so you should be able to sacrifice yourself entirely for. And if you in that sense, if you fully experience the thing, you would actually be God yourself. But people sometimes fight to overthrow regimes and they fail, right? And there is always a reason in that too. The root of every temporal power is therefore spiritual authority, which is almost a quote, divine nature disguised in human form. Right, I'm quoting from the Laws of Manu 7.8, which is also known as the Manusmriti, like it's Hindu. So you're talking about essentially a collection of Vedic legal codes and treatises on the Dharma that is, of course, important for the subject matter. The text is believed to have been composed around 200 BC, reflecting, social and cultural values of previous times in the Indo-European tradition. And it was written down actually much later, telling the truth. And it talks about, the principles of government and administration, etc. And this goes on saying, the ruler is not, quote, a mere mortal, but rather, quote, a great deity standing in the form of a man. So this plays as a definition with the relative thing that, of course, there is a divine dimension within the guy, that there would be by standard, but not to that great extent, right? So it's the degree you can imbue humanity with this, which makes it even more fundamental to understand properly how spiritually superior God is, and so how superior spirituality is over matter, right? Because from this little man, you can have enough power to get all that power. In this sense, it's still very comforting. Like, of course, man is understood in tradition as the most superior form of life on Earth, right? So that we are predisposed as humans to have that kind of strength and power and capacity that can move really so much, right? And the history of civilization proves it, but when we'll talk about Indo-European law, for example, we will see what the ancestral understanding of this, let's say, human exposure to the forces of the universe really was, to the point that the ardent waters of the psyche were the same ones of the Milky Way, literally, that were being mirrored within the heart of man, that is his soul, spirit. So the power, literally, of the stars, and so of God, and his various hypostases within us. The Egyptian pharaoh was believed to be the manifestation of Ra or of Horus, notoriously. The kings of Alba Longa and of Rome were supposed to be the incarnations of Jupiter, right? The Assyrian kings of Baal, which was still the godfather of thunder, heaven equivalent, the Persian Shahs of the god of light, we're talking about the only god that ever existed in every religion. The Norse Germanic princes were believed to derive from the race of Thivats, right, of Odin and of the Aesir in general, right, and about Thivats, by the way, that's the son of Theod. So at least this is how the interpretation of Twisto, right, of Tevisco is meant to be, like the son of the sky god, right, and the earth goddess. So essentially the human, but as the ruler and as still the father of the other, in this case of Germanic peoples, that was meant to be exactly like this bridge between heaven and earth, right? There is also actually another etymology for twist that is more common, but I don't think it's correct. It has to do with the sort of double nature, even with twist, like so. This actually could be about the double nature of this king, right? But the point here, in fact, is always the same. All these figures are thought to have the same function politically in tradition. The Hellenic kings of the Dorian-Achaean cycle were called Diostrophes, that is, or Diogenes, that is to say, in literally, I mean, there here is it's essentially God, right, and Genes is generated, like genetics, so literally born out of, like, of divine origin, right? So the meaning is continuously the same. We know, for example, classical Greece, for this sort of secular modern outlook that we've been imposed forcibly by in the last generations, but these people were literally called after their divine ancestry. And we've seen, I made multiple videos about the Hellenic, especially the Dorian, Achaean, say, religion, and how this, of course, rose and fall, but how rigidly connected to that sense of absolute, especially the Greeks. I think among all the at least the Europeans, meaning the Western branch of the Indo-European peoples, really were, right? They were the earlier, the most rigid, also, but that's what conferred even that sclerotic sense of the Greeks separated from all the rest. There were barbarians outside, like saying we got it, but then lowering the standard. And so also the Byzantines, this world that just think that the within exists, very spiritually, of course, in a way as well, but not enough to cope with the external forces, as well as were taken over by the Romans, then by effect by the Franks, etc. And their meaning was primarily this, right? So beyond the variety of mythical and sacred expressions, the recurrent view of kinship is expressed in terms of an immanent transcendence that is present and active in the world. The sense that power is manifest, right? That it is to be if it wins, right? Over the war, right? It may not be seen initially. There might be a becoming in the process. Not everybody can see because it's the eyes of the soul that really have to be able to perceive that. But in that sense, the least they're able to see it, the more they're giving way to his power, right? So they're going to be crushed, right? So it's not, again, a way of wishful thinking. This guy is king for some strange reason. His power must make things work, because at that point the general understanding is that he is the one, right? The king, who has believed to be a sacred being and not a man by virtue of his being, was already, in fact, at the center and the apex of the community, right? Leaders do not rise to power just from a day to another, right? And even when there is this fierce competition for it, of course, things tend to be risky, right? Because it's very difficult to judge somebody's capacity. We've seen it also in the Clausewitzian theory as far as command is concerned. Like, you can't quite so easily identify even what was the merit of a general in the outcome of a given battle that has already happened, right? You have to inquire that. It's not immediately visible, right? Because most of what happens in the world is unfortunately not visible, because we're not enough to be able to see it. In the king was also the supernatural strength that made his ritual actions effective. Right? In these actions, people could recognize the earthly counterpart of supernatural ruling, right, as well as the supernatural support of life in the world of tradition. And of course, people's consciences were called to respond whenever this person was unfit for the task, right? For example, in Greece and Rome, if the king was found unworthy of the priestly office, he could no longer be king. That's how the Romans had overthrown their monarchy, and the Greeks, right, in a less documented way, but still, right, in, say, times that pertain more to myth than history, but still, of course, that did happen, and that do not speak favorably of the, say, of the nature of leadership, because the ages are, again, passing, and things are worsening. It's just like also in the Irish mythology, the king that is of gold, but he is a hand cut, right? His god is perfect, except he's actually challenged into combat, his hand is cut, and he uses a silver prosthesis, right? That shows how not even the greatest rulers are immune from potential fall, because that is within the nature of the spirit. The spirit can decide, as we've seen before, whether to succeed or not, right? Can decide whether to have fear or not. And the fall of mankind happened in the moment in which we decided to fear, the greatest sin of all, right? And for this reason, however, leaders were the best elements, right, of the, say, they were the supreme form of government, like any, this is universally valid, independently from institutional, in fact, mechanisms in relation to the various polities and how they're organized. And thus everything is essentially in the natural order of things. The ancients were just more aware of the linearity of this concept than we are, right? And we see in politics just another chance for saying our own thing without actually solving anything. And the most important aspect that we were pointing out before is that this order did not need physical strength to assert itself. Right? When it did, it was only sporadically. The sense, again, is that the age of order that had to regulate the world had to simply stem in the highest levels of standards from mere immanent transcendence visible to anybody. That's the Alexandrian model, for which the Magus would just, in theory, walk into the east and right and see the gates, the city gates open to him. Where he obviously had to fight through, but the sense was that the greater the king, the least he needed to impose himself violently, because it meant at that point there was nobody who could resist him, which of course can have an absolute or relative value compared to who is opposing him. But the fact that even the strongest wouldn't oppose him at some point meant that he was like a just ruler, and therefore the divine one that was really giving the universe its natural order. But of course, in all mythology, again, nothing is forever, because this, by pretending that, it means that you would lower the guard and not making the thing working again. So the utmost ideal was the ruler imposing himself mainly and irresistibly through the spirit. And there is an interesting Indo-Vedic text, the Nitisara 4.4, is a Sanskrit treatise on statecraft and political science, right? And so this was written by the Indian scholar Kamandak in the 7th century AD, right? Outlining the principles of governance and administration, in fact, for a just and stable society, stating the dignity of a god enjoys on earth is splendid, but hard to achieve for the weak. Only he who sets his soul on this objective is worthy to become a king. So this shows you that process of bridge building, right? The fact that there is no such thing like an immediate accession, without value, but that also that value cannot be attained but through an incredibly hard work that must be cultivated over time. It requires a spiritual preparation. The ruler thus appears as, quote, a follower of the discipline that is practiced by those who are gods among men, which is an incredible shout for civilizational model. Right here, the idea is that those who have been in charge before have to set the example for those who come after. This is a fully traditional principle, and it basically teaches to look at history for politically, right? And all what you hear about history today is social, right? Saying things happen for no reason. There is society, there are people who are out there without any sense, right? Of course, these people traditionally are provided, as we've seen, with some power individually. But it's all structuralism, it's all determinism, it's all relativism, it's all nothing traditional, actually, and purposely so. Because, of course, the only thing that matters, the primary thing that matters, is leadership, is rule, is what the most reasonable element of the Clausewitzian Trinity really does, right? The one that subordinates to itself violence and order, right, in the military instrument. This is fundamentally important. You've seen Themis before, seen as the son of the god of heaven and the one of earth, right? And Zeus and Hera weren't happy, for example, of Ares at all, because he was just a barbarian, right? He just followed his impulses. He didn't have the Apollonian light of Athena that would triumph over him all the time, because he was cold, rational, and would slaughter anybody without shedding a tear, right, when she intentionally set herself to pursue that goal. And Athena was the goddess of war in this sense, but a rational war, and the war also of the polis that were, in this sense, what the Greeks thought of course of themselves as the perfect world, where this reason would triumph as the divinely ordered one. So this makes you understand a lot anthropologically, because it really unveils the unambiguous concept that everything starts from the form and who orders it. This doesn't mean that there must be a totalitarian ruler, that the forms in which we, or a monarchy, well, this is not important, because that's still so far from God that the form here doesn't, the type of institution doesn't necessarily matter, except we have seen how weak those systems are at a point. And of course, the idea that a society is stronger if the individuals are stronger, not in function of themselves, but in function of the group, and so in function of God, right, as the largest, say, container role, is the only thing that truly matters. And such age of order was essentially the purpose of all these people's political achievement. And again, it was much more clearly close to these people's understanding than today. Well, our enormous amount of publications and studies and whatever, these people had already sorted everything out. And they were right. And the reason why we can't sort this out is that we're still thinking that there is something greater than God, rather than our narcissistic, individualistic idea that we must come up above the others, but without essentially cultivating any quality to deserve it at the end of the day. Because we don't see the point of cultivating any value. Right, but just of satisfying our most immediate material needs, and so not really going far beyond, because we are part not pressured, except that this happens because we're simply looking away from what is really meaningful and should really matter, well above anything else. All right. So these are the little introductions to the theme of regality in tradition, but we'll of course come back on it because it's just the beginning. Right? You have to look at all the solar symbolism. We have to really start an important series now that we can't quite just say no to in the first place. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.